Let's look at this data that came in on Thursday. What does it say to you about the labor markets? We've been talking now about the labor markets for a good few months. What does this number show? It shows that the expectation was that jobless claims would be at 700, they were at 770, and that continuing jobless claims from the state program came in at just below where it was the month before, I'm sorry, the week before at 4.12 million. What's your takeaway here? What's happening?
It kind of seems like the jobs that have been lost are it's seemingly going to stay lost for a while, and they're not returning for the foreseeable future.
I think that you're right. I think that, as we said, you've got 6.9 or 7 million job openings, but you've got 10 million jobs missing from the labor market, and you've got 10 million people that are still out of work. What happened in Texas just a couple of, within the last couple of weeks, we talked about in detail.
The power grid?
Right, the power grid. And so we have an unwinterized power grid that froze over during an unexpected winter storm, despite the fact that for years Texas has been warned that this was a black swan event that would inevitably happen, and so it did. And so we see a surge in filings for the week before. And as you can see here, pardon me, the headline was unemployment claims jumped to a 1-month high as Texas unemployment insurance applications surge in the winter freeze. I'm showing this data to you because a lot has been spoken about the Fed's decision last week to come out really strong on adhering to a low interest rate policy for the coming couple of years and what the implications are of that are, just as the federal government is deploying a nearly $2 trillion rescue package, and what will likely be followed by a $3 trillion spending package on, among other things, infrastructure around the country. And so there's a lot of concern about, A, is the Fed doing the right thing? And B, can the economy sustain this kind of leverage, this kind of borrowing? And so I wanted to zero in on a bit of granular detail. There's lots of data that we can look at, but just here in regards to the labor market, the continuing jobless claims number of 4.12 million is a bit deceptive. Why? Because it doesn't take into consideration all the people that are on unemployment insurance that includes state and federal programs, plus the emergency programs that are in place since the pandemic got underway a year ago. And so what we're talking about, if you look here, is continuing benefits. This is as of February 27th. You see 18.2 million people. And if you look at just the emergency assistance here, pandemic unemployment assistance, emergency unemployment coverage, extended benefits, this is short-term compensation, additional state benefits, you're talking 13, 14 million people, right? And if you're comparing that to the year before, look where we were in February of last year when unemployment was at 3.5% just before the pandemic exploded and the world really turned on its ear. What's the takeaway here about the labor market? Is it strong? Is it weak? Is the Federal Reserve overreacting?
Well, to me, it seems pretty.
What's that, Alec?
It seems pretty weak, to be honest. It's not recovering fully, and it's been a while. The government is putting a lot of cash in the system to maintain these people that are unemployed, and that can go both ways, can be good and bad, because some people may feel like, okay, now I'm not working and I'm getting paid, so let me take some more time for myself. While on the other hand, yeah, incentives.
Please go ahead and finish.
Yeah, the unemployment system.
You mean you're talking about people that are getting more in their unemployment insurance than they actually make in their work?
Yeah.
Well, Morgan Stanley did a pretty extensive study of that, and the vast majority of people went back to work once the jobs became available again if they had been furloughed, despite making more in their unemployment benefits. And what is the reason for that? Because people like to work. They like the status of having a job. Nobody wants to get unemployment aid unless they have to. And so that was what has been disproven. I know that's a common a myth that the federal government has, upset the labor markets because they're giving people more unemployment insurance than they would actually earn. So you're discouraging people from going back to work. That seems not to be the case. So I think, though, your initial point with regard to the persistent weakness in the labor market is clear, and that this is what these numbers do make clear, is that these are just unprecedented numbers. The 770,000 initial jobless claims this past week have been at this level now for months and months and months, for the better part of a year, since last April, when we peaked at what we lost 22 million jobs in the month of April, and now we've been going at 700,000 jobs a month. So there's an enormous number of jobs that is missing from the economy, and I think that these numbers confirm the direction that support the direction that the Fed's taking. The other bit of data I wanted to show you was debt figures for 2020. So the national debt right now is just over 28 trillion. As of end of 2020, it was at 27.8 trillion. The interest that we paid on the debt last year was about 522 or 523 billion. What's the percent of that? You paid 522 or 23 billion on debt of nearly 28 trillion. What's the average interest rate cost? Well, I'll answer, it's less than 2%. So what would Keynes say? In other words, that we see the labor market is very weak. You've got 20 million people, roughly, well, a little over 18 million people that are still getting unemployment claims, whereas last year it was just over 2 million. This is an historic injury to the U.S. labor markets. And in the absence of any other solution, what is the solution that is available to us? The limited toolkit that we have, the Federal Reserve doing exactly what it's doing, giving long-term forward guidance that will keep rates low well into 2023, that won't preemptively raise rates if inflation touches a 2 or over 2% for a period of time, and along with historic support coming from the federal government. And what would Keynes say that we could do other than that? And what has history shown us that we can do other than that? Not very much. As you pointed out, some of you have been very good about pointing out the movement in the bond markets. So let's take a look at the bond markets. This is the bond markets. We see that we look at the yield curve beginning in January 2020 when unemployment was at 3.5 or 6%. Then we look at a year later in January 2021, and then at the beginning of this month and at the end of this month. So where were we in January 2020? Well, inflation was historically low. Job claims were inflation was low. Job claims were low. Unemployment was historic 50-year lows. Where was the yield curve? The yield curve was flat. Why was the yield curve flat? There was a bit of uncertainty related to what? News about the coronavirus in China. Yes? Now we see what's happened a year later. Where is the yield curve? Well, the short end of the curve has significantly dropped. The long end of the curve is beginning to peak. So what's happening here is what are we observing here? We're seeing a yield curve that's steepening. Yes? If we focus on the 2 and 10 year, which is a measure, a barometer for risk in the domestic markets, you see what's happening. Well, in early 2020, before the pandemic took hold, the spread between 2 and 10 years was pretty small, 30 basis points, showing limited risk anticipated in the marketplace. And what's happened over the course of the last year as, well, the coronavirus has taken an enormous toll on the economy and on the American way of life. And we look at the capital markets, which have responded as we would expect the capital markets to do. The spread between the long end of the curve and the short end and the long end of the curve is steepening, is widening, is broadening. The curve itself is steepening in anticipation of a strong recovery on the heels of ongoing fiscal and monetary support in the economy. In other words, the bond markets are doing exactly what we expect them to be doing. Yes? And the Federal Reserve is doing exactly what we expect the Federal Reserve to be doing. Along the lines of what John Keynes talked about in the beginning of the 20th century, that was so instructive to Franklin Roosevelt, that gave way to the New Deal, that now, almost 100 years later, has given way to what many are arguing is the biggest change to the social safety net since, well, the New Deal, and of course, the changes that were made under the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, but particularly the New Deal. Are there any questions or comments here about this current data that's just come out last week in our examination of it? So if anyone asks you, is the Fed doing what it's supposed to be doing? You can say yes, because there's nearly 20 million people that are still getting unemployment benefits, which is historically way out of proportion from what it should be. And therefore, the Fed and the federal government are both doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that's why the markets are behaving the way they're behaving.
Professor,
Okay.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead, Andrew.
If
Sure.
interest rates rise, will the Fed be able to pay off the interest? Like, you know what I'm saying?
Right. Is there a fear that the interest rate will rise? What happens as the economy begins to expand? The present value of those payments becomes lower and lower as the economy expands. Yes?
Okay, yeah.
Right. Okay. So the belief is that this policy, the combination of these two policies, fiscal and monetary policy, will be very expansionary. And the bet is that that's going to supercharge the economy in a very positive way. And we would expect to see upward pressure on interest rates as investors sell their positions and look to move cash into other assets that are going to generate more of a return, particularly on the heels of the Federal Reserve coming out last week in the form of the chairman himself making clear to the capital markets around the world that the Fed's not going to budge for a good 2 years. That's a pretty significant statement that we saw last Wednesday. We talked about that in class. So unless there's anything else, I'm going to move on to our current lesson tonight.
Oh, Professor, I have another question. So
Yeah.
why is there a fear of interest rates rising if the Fed could pay it off or whatnot? And what's the
Well, there's always a fear of interest rates rising. If interest rates rise, that makes the cost of money. Interest rates make the cost of money higher. It also makes the return on money. It also can make the return on money higher. What is the fear? The fear is that with an expanding economy, there will be upward pressure on wages. There will be upward pressure on prices. That will lead to upward pressure on. Pardon me. Go ahead.
That will be also going through. We will enter into inflation.
Right. So there's there's upward pressure. There's inflationary pressures as a result of an expanding economy, all of which is a natural byproduct of a growing and healthy economy. But there's always a concern that the economy becomes overheated, and if interest rates rise too quickly, well, then the Fed is going to if the economy moves too quickly, the Fed will step in and interest rates will begin to tighten, and credit conditions will continue to tighten if the economy becomes overheated. But the expectation is that that's not going to happen, because what did we see in 2008? We saw a soft landing when the Great Recession came to an end in 2009, early 2010. The economy recovered tremendously, and the same people that were running things back in 2008 are running things now. Joe Biden and Janet Yellen, along with the team of brilliant men and women that support the Federal Reserve and all of its duties, and of course that support the president and all of his duties, much as it did when he was in charge of the rescue program under Obama back in 2008. And so, yes, there's a natural fear that interest rates are going to rise due to inflationary pressures as a result of a growing economy. And the question is will the Fed be able to handle things correctly, so that they don't raise interest rates too slowly, and they don't raise interest rates too quickly, to short stop or to cut short an expansion. What the markets would like to see, just let me add a point, it came to my mind. What the markets would like to see is the axiomatic soft landing. That is what's defined as, the Fed having done everything exactly right, so that they won't raise interest rates preemptively, which is why they told us last week they don't care if there's a 2% inflation, not just in the in the rearview mirror, but in the, right in front of us. If inflation is up at 2%, they're not going to preemptively raise rates, or before that. And so that was a very important signal that they reiterated again last week emphatically. What was the question, please?
So I just wanted to say that there's a little bit of a difference going on here than in 2008, though. In 2008, the monetary policy was really, looking at businesses, right? Where we rescued the banks, we rescued the auto industry, and now this monetary policy is more looking at the population.
You're talking about it's a much broader rescue.
The population.
It's a much broader rescue.
Mm-hmm.
You're absolutely right. It's a much broader rescue that's touching every area of American life. Yes, please go ahead, finish.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, while the Fed policy was pretty much the same, right, where the interest rates were kept low, this is still uncharted territory because the monetary policy is different. It worked before. I guess we are assuming that it's going to work this time around as well. But I think we still have a long way to figure out if it is going to work with the injection of all that money into the economy.
I don't disagree with you. In other words, it's on a scale much larger than what we saw in 2008 during the Great Recession. Yes, that's your point. Yes. So the scale is much larger. Wait a second. The scale is much larger, but look at the scale of pain. Look at the scale of damage. Mm-hmm. And what are we, as a $30 trillion behemoth of a nation, expected to do if people can't put food on their table or pay their rent? What are we expected to do? What can we do? Should we worry about paying back the bills? Of course we should worry about paying back the bills. But since we're borrowing at less than 2%, what else should we do right now? Right now, we've got to take care of all of these major issues. And these major issues include making sure that people can put food on their table, pay their bills, pay their rent, pay their mortgage, and that we, the federal government, that is, including the Federal Reserve and the administration, the Congress, our legislators, do everything they possibly can to support the recovery. Because as we're looking here at these numbers, you've got nearly 20 million people still out collecting unemployment benefits. We're a year into this. And so there's a disconnect between where we were in the beginning of 2020 and where we are now in the beginning of 2021. And we've got a lot of ground to recover. And while people are very happy to go and run around, as we're seeing in places like Miami and other places that have lowered their restrictions, or at this time now, spring is here and spring break, a lot of colleges like yourselves are going on holiday. What's the percentage of the population that's been inoculated? Anybody?
I think it's like 25%, right? I think it's about 25%.
I think it's about 13 or 14% that have been inoculated. And so where do we need to be in order to reach what we call herd immunity, where we can say we're back to normal?
At least more than a half.
75 to 85.
I think it was 75%.
85 to 90% of the population needs to be inoculated. So we're quite a ways away from that. We are. And that's why the health professionals are telling us we need to continue to model good behavior. We need to wear masks. And even if we're inoculated, there are certain restrictions we need to follow, because that's just where we are. And all you need to do is look at the more than 500,000 Americans that are dead in the last year as a result of this terrible thing to know that that's the right thing to do. That being said, if we do everything right, we will get to where we need to be sooner rather than later, and hopefully all of us will be back in class next fall. So it's the same thing here with the markets. Well, in terms of the U.S. borrowing more in order to fund these initiatives, whether it's the rescue package that's just being passed, or to fund what could be a $3 trillion spending bill in order to finance the desperately needed work on our crumbling infrastructure. Is it in America's best interest to do these things? Is it in the national interest of the country to do these things? Well, in the first case, it's imperative. The rescue package is imperative to, as we said, make sure that people have enough food to eat and can pay their bills, et cetera, et cetera. and not to mention schools that have PPE and municipalities that can pay that can balance their budgets and so on and so forth. Issues large and small. But in terms of the national security and in terms of the national security and the country's ability to function successfully, we have to remain vigilant with regard to what we're told to do. Was there a comment here?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's important also to understand that the causes of crisis in 08 and in 2020 are quite different, because in 08, it was like uncontrolled because the economy itself crashed. But what we've seen here, it's basically as soon as we over this COVID, economy will go back into kind of like speedy recovery. So it's much easier to manage. And what we see now by injecting this huge amounts of money, it's basically just life support to get through that period while we on lockdowns and things like that.
Can you repeat that last part there?
Yeah, so basically these are injections into market. It's just basically life support while economy not.
That's right. So massive cash infusion. Right. Mm-hmm.
And as soon as we get over this and economy will go back up, it will recover quite speedily.
Right. Well, that's the point, that the money is going to help grease the wheels of a recovery and help to accelerate any type of recovery that the markets expect, the equity markets expect, the bond markets expect. That's why we see a steepening yield curve. That's why we see a frothy, an excited or dynamic equity market. Obviously, there are some areas in the equity markets that are experiencing some down days, like the Nasdaq we talked about last week. But overall, the signs are encouraging for a lot of growth in this third and fourth quarter of 2021, and the capital markets seem to be confirming that wherever we look for the data. I'm going to move forward from here, and we're going to start a review. We're going to talk about tariffs. Was there a comment? I'm sorry. There was a. Okay, sure, that's fine. So there was a question last week that I didn't provide a sufficient answer for, and I apologize for that. But with regard to the value of tariffs, we know that tariffs have had their place in American the growth of the American economy in terms of policy used to revitalize a particular industry or support an infant industry, whether it was the early days of the internet or the aerospace industry or broadband, for example. We know that. However, what do we say is the modern case for a tariff? The modern case for a tariff really comes down to the support of a particular infant industry, but also for national interest concerns. Because what do nations do? They use tariffs to defend national interests, regardless sometimes of what the negative welfare costs may be. However, in the United States, since the end of World War II, what's been the policy of the government, the US government, to move away from tariffs, to move away from a tariff regime. But in fact, in 1789, we had the Tariff Act of 1789, and between 1789 and 1913, when the income taxes started for the first time in 1913. So between 1789 and 1913, tariffs were the single biggest source of revenue for the federal government. So for the better part of the 19th century, tariffs were the biggest revenue generator for the country. So the country would, the Washington legislators would impose a 5% ad valorem tariff on everything. So they'd have 5% stamps made that would be tagged on every good that came into the country. So 1913, what happens? The income taxes start 1913, right? What do we see in the 1920s? We see this is the Gilded Age, and we see rising income inequality. And what do we see in 1930? We see the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which did what? In an effort to support the farming sector, agricultural products, Smoot-Hawley, a Tariff Act of 1930 imposed enormous tariffs on a wide variety of goods. What did that do to overall trade? It shrunk trade by 2/3 and preceded, of course, the Great Recession. Now we've got World War II. We leave World War II triumphant. The U.S. was the victor along with the other allied nations, and fascism was beaten. And we have the general agreements on tariffs and trade. What was the objective of GATT, among other things? To pursue free trade among free nations. And one of those objectives, and that objective included the elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. What's the successor organization to GATT? Does anybody remember we talked about that in the beginning?
The World Trade Organization?
World Trade Organization. Trishana, thank you. The World Trade Organization, excellent, is the successor organization in 1995 to GATT 1947, which continues to uphold the original objectives of eliminating all tariffs and non-tariff barriers. Because what? Because tariffs and non-tariff barriers prevent natural market corrections from happening. They lead to lower trader volume and lower national welfare. We talked about, well, that was my comment about the importance of tariffs as a source of revenue for the U.S. After World War II, it became a much less important source of revenue. And as we saw ourselves, overall tariff rates in the U.S. run, below 3%. They're very, very low tariffs here in the country because it's not a major source of revenue. We talked about the idea that tariffs should not be used unless there's a reason to start them and a reason to stop them. A reason that a nation might use a tariff is to dissuade or to persuade another nation to stop or to cease some type of unfair trade practices that it perceives. For example, the U.S. imposes tariffs on France for using subsidies to support their aerospace industry. In the absence of tariffs, what's the hope of the WTO? That nations will bring claims against other nations within the World Trade Organization, and that's been working over the last. Excuse me, can you mute your microphone? That's been.
You potentially would have to stop sharing screen for him to mute everyone. So I don't know if that would be possible right now.
I'm not going to do that. So anyway, but thank you for the heads up. So anyway, in terms of getting back to the bit of the history, so as we said, tariffs played a huge role as a revenue generator for the first half of the country and first half of the history of the country into the early part of the 20th century. America's position changes. That's gone on now through, of course, the start of the 21st century. As the U.S. continues to pursue free trade objectives, that's, of course, with the exception of what we saw under Donald Trump, which was a return to mercantilist ideas and a movement away from trade, a movement away from our allies and our historical alliances around the world. And we saw the impact on overall trade volume, which was to shrink, and we've talked about that. So here we looked at a small nation, and we saw what? We saw that the small nation is a price taker. The small nation faces a perfectly elastic supply curve. Yes? The supply curve, well, let's go back to autarky. At autarky, the nation is producing and selling 50 cars at $9,500 a unit. So therefore, we were identified consumer surplus, which is the difference between what the consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay, and the producer surplus, which is the revenue producers receive above variable costs. I'm going through this in some bit of detail. I know we've done it. It won't take long, but it will help you for the exam. So if there are questions, please jump in. We said that in free trade, what happens? The nation faces a perfectly elastic supply curve. They're a price taker. It doesn't matter how much they demand, the price they face is always going to be the same. Can somebody tell me? I'm going to stop the share. How do I do the mute?
Under participants, you click on participants, then you look on the right of your screen. You should have the controls on muting.
Right.
Okay, he already muted himself.
Okay, fair enough. All right.
Fine.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so here we go. So what happens at free trade? Well, of course, the nation's going to benefit from, and consumers are going to benefit for access to the cheap cars. The price comes down from $9,500 to $8,000 a unit. What happens though, of course, domestic production is going to fall, overall consumption is going to rise because now consumers can get cheaper goods, cheaper cars, right? And we see what happens here. Imports or production is down to 20, consumption up at 80, and overall imports are at 60, right? Now, domestic producers demand protection in the form of a tariff. Well, they get the form of the protection, they get the tariff protection, but what happens? The full burden of the tariff is borne by whom? It's borne by the consumers, because the nation's a price taker. Suppliers around the world aren't going to change their price or absorb any part of the tariff as a result of what this nation does or doesn't do, because it's a small nation. As we said, it's a price taker. So we identify here the loss in welfare to the small nation as a result of the imposition of the tariff. So we went from 8,000 to the tariff-induced price of 9,000, and we can plot out the welfare effects as we see here. We have our redistributive effect, which is the transfer of consumer surplus to producer surplus, because now we're paying $9,000 instead of $8,000 a unit. The protective effect, because as a result of the tariff, domestic production has increased from 20 to 40. Now that's not a good thing. It just means it's more efficient production. It's more inefficient production displacing efficient production, lower cost production. Then there's the revenue effect, which is the collection of tariff revenue. And then there's the consumption effect, because consumption falls from 80 units down to 60 units. And overall imports fall from what? Fall from 80 to 20 units. We can plot out quantify all of the various welfare effects here. The protective effect plus the consumption effect, of course, is your deadweight welfare losses. And that's it. Again, the key here with small nations, they absorb the consumers absorb the full cost, the full brunt, the burden of the tariff, because suppliers won't absorb any of the cost of the tariff. Any questions here on small nation tariffs?
So what should the small nation do then? It feels like either way they lose. Right?
Well, everybody loses with a tariff. There's tariffs, so you get a very concentrated benefit at the expense of many. So a very small group of people benefit at the expense of many. You have 140,000 steel and aluminum workers, but you've got 11 million people that work in those industries that use steel and aluminum, that saw their costs go up as a direct result of the Trump-induced tariffs on steel and aluminum that had no rationale, that had no backing or justification in modern economic theory to apply steel and aluminum tariffs. Certainly not certainly not because of national interest concern, which was the reason that was put forward. So in terms of your question, sorry? Well, wait, let me get back. The question was what's the benefit to the small nation? Well, the benefit to the small nation is they get to collect some tariff revenue, and they give a leg up to their domestic industry. The domestic industry it's good for the domestic industry. It's good for import competing domestic suppliers, for those producers, the owners of those resources of production, which are labor that works within those import competing businesses, and the owners of those businesses. They do well. They benefited from, but at the expense of many. Does that answer your question? I don't know who asked that.
Yes, it was me. I asked that because I come from a.
Yamu, hi.
Yes,
Yeah.
how are you? Yeah, because I'm originally from a smaller country too, and we do have this with the tariff and the products that are being shipped there they are more expensive than even here in America. So I'm like, who benefits from this at the end? So that's why.
Well, we know the government does. We know that small nations, oftentimes low income, moderate income nations, use tariffs as a way to generate enormous amounts of revenue. Whether it's a country like Bangladesh or Russia, we know that tariffs are a very big part of their revenue sources. There was another question following.
Oh yeah. So you mentioned that there's no logic to Trump raising tariffs. So if it's like
There's no logic. There's no rationale.
My question
Yeah.
is,
Right.
why would his advisors, with the common knowledge, like why would his advisors, I assume PhD people and whatnot, why would they tell him it's a good idea? Why would they stop him?
As though having a PhD meant that you never were wrong. That's right. You have a PhD. You're never making a mistake. But you know that that's not true. Why would they advise him? Well, who is he trying to single out with the tariffs?
The Chinese.
There you go. Good headlines, good PR, good way to rattle the saber. The U.S. is going to take on the invading Chinese. I mean, aside from the blatant, flying from the blatant xenophobia of it all. Well, of course. I mean, one thing Donald Trump showed was that he is nothing if not a political animal who really calibrates his every move based upon what the news coverage is going to be. And he picked a fight with China because it resonated with blue-collar workers in a part of this country that have seen their jobs outsourced to other parts of the world without the type of support that they needed here to retrain, replace, reorganize, unfortunately, as we've seen before, those are the very people that end up voting against their own self-interest, believing that those manufacturing jobs will come back, and in fact, they don't come back. But I don't want to get too far afield from that. So, are there any questions here before we move on to the large nation model?
Yes, I do have a question, Professor. So I see that on point B and D, it is called a deadweight loss. So that's
right.
That's like a waste, but in what sense? Like
in the sense that we were at free trade, we were producing 50 units at $9,500 a unit. Then at autarky, we were producing 50 units at $9,500 a unit. Then as a result of free trade, which we say is a good thing, domestic production falls because the global price is $8,000 a unit, which means that global suppliers are producing it more efficiently than domestic suppliers. So domestic production falls. Overall consumption increases, which increases overall global trade volume and overall domestic and global welfare. With the imposition of the tariff, what happens? Well, it's great for domestic producers because they get to increase their production from 20 units to 40 units, but it's bad for overall global welfare. Why? Because what are you doing? You're encouraging high-priced domestic production, which isn't efficient at all. It's a political tool. It's a way to reward political industry. It's a way to reward domestic industry. Okay. It can be also a way to protect domestic industry when it's essential for the national interest or it's in the interest of a particularly important infant industry, like, for example, we could say clean energy, which is a nascent industry. Does that help?
Perfect. Yes. Thank you.
Sure. So now,
Professor,
yeah, sure.
So are producers always better off with tariffs compared to non-tariff?
Producers, domestic import competing producers would prefer tariffs because it grants them protection that they wouldn't otherwise have in a free marketplace against low-price producers. So if you're a domestic producer, you're likely to lobby for some type of trade protection to protect against low-cost imports. That doesn't mean that makes sense or that it's the rational policy when you take into consideration overall global welfare. We looked the other day at the tire tariffs under Obama. So you gained 1,200 jobs, but at what cost? $900,000 a job. $900,000 a job. So you had an extraordinarily high cost to protect jobs that pay a fraction of that, and passed on over $1 billion in additional costs to consumers who are paying for higher priced tires. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, sure. So we talk about a large nation. Again, like we looked at the other day, just as a review, we see that at autarky, the nation was selling 70 units at $9,600 a unit. And here, the nation doesn't face a perfectly elastic curve. It faces an elastic supply curve. It has an inelastic supply curve because the price depends upon the quantity demanded because it's a large nation like the United States. And how much the US buys is going to affect the price. The more it buys, the lower the price. The less it buys, the higher the price. This is the impact that a large nation has as opposed to a small nation or price taker nation. So we saw that at free trade, the nation faced a price of $8,000 a unit, at which it was going to increase consumption from 70 to 110, but domestic production falls from 70 to 30. That, of course, hurts import competing producers, car manufacturers, and folks, labor of the auto industry. It hurts those two groups. Owners of the car manufacturers and labor in the car industry, right? As overall production shrinks as a result of free trade, right? But it's good for consumers because they're paying less per car than they were before, yes? And so now they're paying $8,000 a unit. They're buying more, they're producing less. Well, the industry asked for a tariff. Well, the tariff raises the supply curve as we see here, and the new price is at $8,800 a unit. Well, why is that? Because the car manufacturer has decided to absorb part of the cost of the tariff in a bid to do what? To protect its market share, yes? So it's going to it wants to sell as many cars as it can at a tariff-induced price, but will absorb part of the tariff in order to retain its market. So we see, though, that we can again plot the welfare effects here. We have the, before we do the welfare effects, I'm going a bit too quickly, I see. When the tariff was imposed, what happened? Overall domestic production again increases from 30 to 50. Overall consumption is going to fall to 90 because the price went from 9,600 to 8,000 back up to 8,800. So obviously you're going to crowd out some of the consumers, but it's great for domestic producers who are happy to produce at that to produce and sell at that higher cost. Yes, and so we're able to plot the welfare effects as we've done before. The difference here is that we have the terms of trade effect. The terms of trade effect is the effect of the foreign producer absorbing part of the cost of the tariff, which we know here was $200. And so we have our redistributive effect, our protective effect, our revenue effect, our tariff effect, and our protective effect, and our terms of trade effect. Excuse me. So your redistributive effect here, your deadweight losses, again, your protective and consumption effect, your revenue effect, which is your tariff revenue here, plus your terms of trade effect. And we were very clear about this the other day. And we said that what's the optimal strategy? You want to maximize the positive difference between the terms of trade effect and the deadweight losses, which is your protective effect and your consumption effect. But why is it called the beggar thy neighbor policy? Because an optimal tariff means what? It means I win, you lose. A win for me is a loss for the exporting nation. So the exporting nation is going to have what? Less to buy all the goods and services that I, the U.S., want to sell as a result of those, let's say in our example, with steel and aluminum tariffs. So U.S. producers that use steel and aluminum are paying higher prices as a result of the Trump steel and aluminum tariffs. They pass those costs on to their consumers. That means that they're selling fewer products that use steel and aluminum as a result of the steel and aluminum tariffs, and that's going to lower overall national welfare. Okay. Again, here I told the optimal strategy is maximize the positive difference. It's a beggar thy neighbor policy. The optimal tariff is only beneficial to the importing nation. Are there any questions here? A summary of what we looked at the other day?
Professor, could you explain a little bit more the supply curve, the SD plus W plus D and SD plus
right. So in other
W?
words, you have the domestic, you have the supply and demand of the nation at autarky, right?
Yes.
Here we are at autarky, supply and demand of the nation. Well, if you have the supply and demand of the nation, you have the supply of the nation, which equals the domestic supply plus the world supply. Well, it's an inelastic curve because it's a large nation and the price will depend upon the quantity demanded. Now with the tariff, the overall supply curve is going to increase by the amount of the tariff, but the price itself doesn't increase by the full amount of the tariff because part of the tariff is being absorbed by the exporting nation. But the new tariff curve, the new tariff-induced supply curve is the supply, which is the domestic supply plus the world supply plus the tariff. Does that make sense to you there, Alec?
Yes, it makes more sense.
Okay, so a question came up the other day, last week, a comment came up about in terms of elasticity of demand. And so, of course, with a small nation which faces a perfectly elastic supply curve, there's no opportunity for a terms of trade effect benefit. Terms of trade won't change regardless of how much the small nation buys or doesn't buy. They face a constant price. But because of the elasticity, the shape of the nature of the elasticity of supply in a large nation, well, then of course, the terms of the opportunity for improving terms of trade does exist, which is what we're just identifying here. I saw a note on my note. I saw a note on my notes from last Wednesday's class about a comment that one of you raised. I wanted to make sure that we were clear about that.
Yeah, I raised that. I was thinking about it right now actually. I wasn't like satisfied with the answer last week, but now
I'm sorry?
That satisfies my question.
Okay, good, because I did as I said. I made a note of it. I wanted to make sure that we got back to that. So let's get back to our welfare effects. So we see our welfare effects. We're able to quantify them. Simple geometric shapes. We know that we're looking to optimize the positive difference between your terms of trade effect and your deadweight losses. We've talked about this.
Professor, I have another question. So
Sure.
I've noticed that there's always a reason for the spaces like foregone, if that makes sense. So when you move up the tariff, there's like space and there's a reason why for that space. So there's no reason for the spot under D or under B.
You mean what spot under B or D?
Like,
you mean that spot,
yeah,
that little triangle here, or this here?
Yeah.
Does that mean anything? No, it doesn't mean anything.
Okay.
Because everything, no, it doesn't mean anything. It's just this. It's just this, right? Right? Because this is the area of your revenue effect, and this represents part of that revenue effect, that overall revenue effect. So,
Professor,
hi, Maria, what's up?
Sorry, so the letter E is the revenue effect on the nation or on
the C is the revenue effect. The C is the collection of tariff revenue, and E is the terms of trade effect, right? The terms of trade effect are your improving terms of trade. Why is it improving terms of trade? Because the full price of the tariff is not being passed along to consumers. The exporting nation is absorbing $200 of the $1,000 tariff, right? So the end price is not 8,000 to 9,000, it's 8,000 to 8,800.
What determines the 200?
What determines the 200 is, well, it's, I'm going to give you, what determines the 200 is the way the chart comes out. And so we are able to plot the increase in the supply curve from here to here. And when we draw the lines, what we get is, we know that we come up with a $200 terms of trade effect here. I'm going to give you the charts on the exam, okay? I will give you the graph on the exam. So you will be given that on the test. So let's move on and look here. We looked at last Wednesday, just as a review, about the how does an import tariff burden domestic consumers, domestic exporters, and we saw very clearly with Caterpillar what happened as a result of an increase in steel tariffs. We saw that this is where the country was at equilibrium, where its marginal cost equals its average cost at every level of output. That the company was producing 100 units at $100,000 a unit and selling at $110,000 a unit with a profit of $1 million overall. As a result of the tariff being imposed, pardon me, as a result of the tariff being imposed, we saw what? The overall price increased. The overall production cost increases from 100 to 105,000. The cost to the consumer increases from 110 to 112.5, which means what? You know right away that overall volume is going to decrease. You're going to sell fewer tractors, and indeed we did. We sold instead of 90, 100 tractors. Yes? And so what does our overall profit look like despite having the tariff in place? Well, the tariff, the profit shrinks from $1 million to 675. So almost, a good third of the profit has been wiped away as a result of the tariff, which increases our costs and lowers our trade volume. Are there any questions here? Okay. So again, last week we talked about as a prime example the steel tariffs. The tariffs on tires in the Obama administration. And I thought it'd be just a moment to take a look again. We saw that China enters the WTO 2001, that tire shipments increased dramatically over a 4-year period into the United States, with plants closed and jobs lost. The Obama administration imposes tariffs for 3 years on Chinese low-priced Chinese-made tires. The Obama administration was saying what? They were enforcing rules. They were reducing tire imports that would boost U.S. industry sales and profitability, and the overall impact would be negligible. Why? Because the cost of a tire was small relative to the overall cost of the car. What was the manufacturer's position on tire tariffs? The low-cost tire market has already been exported abroad years ago. So what market are you protecting? Yes? So what was the result over those 3 years? Well, they created 1,200 new jobs, which is great, and $48 million of additional income, but a $1.1 billion of additional cost passed on to consumers at a cost of $900,000 a job for the tire manufacturing industry. And we know that cheap tires that were blocked out of China were replaced by cheap tires from other countries, just the way China stopped buying soybeans from the US in retaliation for all the tariffs that the Trump administration imposed. They stopped buying American soybeans. They found soybeans from other countries, just the way the US found tires from other countries, Brazil, Indonesia, South Korea. But that didn't stop there. They imposed retaliatory tariffs that had a catastrophic effect on the poultry industry in 2010. What happens? The market collapsed 90%. And so, of course, what have we learned about tariffs? Well, they're a very risky thing. They need to be contemplated very carefully. And if you start a trade war, it's not going to be easy to win. If you impose a tariff, the likelihood is that there will be retaliatory tariffs. We know that the supply of protectionism depends upon a couple of things, just like the demand. Supply depends upon the importance of the industry, like the steel industry or the auto industry versus the coal industry or the copper industry, whether there are large adjustment costs, like fixed legacy costs, like you have in the steel industry or the auto industry, or public sympathy for the auto industry. Back in 2008, the auto industry was poised for bankruptcy. There were a lot of politicians that let them go bankrupt. There's a lot of public sympathy for America's cornerstone industry, which is the automobile industry. Now, the demand is going to depend upon a number of things. Well, how disadvantages the industry? I think of the steel industry. What's the level of import concentration? We talked about the introduction of the Japanese electronics back in the 1960s and 70s, and how they dominated that market, having spent many years after World War II developing dynamic comparative advantages within the electronics and technology industries, right? Demand also depends upon the concentration of domestic production. So again, we get back to the auto industry. And finally, what about export dependence? The aerospace industry depends upon its export market. So it's always very concerned that if the U.S. imposes any type of tariffs, is that going to result in a retaliatory tariff against the U.S. aerospace industry, much like China retaliated against steel tariffs by imposing, by doing what? It stopped buying soybeans, so it punished the agricultural sector in response to being hit in the steel sector. So are there any questions on this review here? So finally, last week we talked about 4 distinct arguments for trade restrictions. We talked about the free trade argument, which says that countries should be allowed to specialize in exchange, and that tariffs and NTVs prevent natural market adjustments from taking place. They reduce trade volume and cause overall economic stagnation. We make the point here that the theory assumes perfectly competitive markets, but we know that nations make decisions about tariffs based upon things other than just welfare effects, whether it's for income, as your class, as one of you just pointed out. Now, I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was. With the nation that you come from, uses tariffs as a means to raise income. It's also used as a way to defend national security. The overall theme, though, about tariffs is that since the end of World War II, there's been a global movement away from tariffs and non-tariff barriers. We talked about the argument that trade restrictions are necessary to protect against cheap foreign labor. And we know that low wages in developing countries are offset by higher productivity in the United States. We looked at those numbers last week. The other argument that trade restrictions are necessary to maintain fairness and a level playing field. But we know that there's a connection between imports and exports. If you impose tariffs on your imports, that's going to affect your export sector. So there's the dual nature of tariffs that have to be considered. But that ultimately, tariffs and NTBs will reduce trade volume and overall global welfare. And finally, the argument that tariffs protect jobs. And again, we say that the nation's exports and imports are closely tied together. Steel tariffs are going to lead to higher prices, lead to less jobs in the industries that use those products as a result of consumer pushback against higher products, even when part of the tariff is going to be absorbed by the exporting nation, because consumers don't like higher prices and have a tendency to push back. So, are there any questions here? Okay, folks. So a very good, thorough review. Let's take a look at some new materials. We talk about the footwear industry in the 1930s, right? The U.S. had a big footwear industry, and that's, of course, long since disappeared as the U.S. has stepped. Pardon me?
Professor, will this cover also the midterm?
Got 20 minutes left, so let's go. Okay, so the footwear industry is now nearly extinct in the United States. However, we have very high tariffs that exist on low-priced footwear that come into this country, as high as 68%. We know that tariffs on cheap imported sneakers are about 48%, but tariffs on expensive imported Italian leather shoes about 9%. So you have very high tariffs placed on low-priced goods, whether it's apparel, footwear, watches, luggage, silverware. Why is that? Well, it's called regressive taxation that unduly burdens low-income households. Those tariffs still exist. In 2013, under the Obama administration, the Footwear Act eliminated about $800 million worth of duties on low to moderately priced footwear, which represented at the time about a third of all footwear imports. Those duties have not been put back in place, so of course that's net positive for global welfare. Now, if we look here, what do we see? We see that we look at the sugar markets, talk about the consequences of protectionism. So look at the raw sugar prices, refined sugar prices, and retail sugar prices here in the United States, from 15 or 16 cents to about 63 cents. Well, U.S. sugar prices are typically 65 to 95% higher than the average world price. The majority of all subsidies, all sugar subsidies, go to the top 10% of producers in the United States. The top 10% of producers own the majority of the sugar farms in the country. So you have a lot of power concentrated in very few hands that receive enormous subsidies from the government to support the sugar market since the 1930s. There have been quotas in place in terms of sugar allowed into the country since the 1930s, and price guarantees since the early 1980s at 22 cents a pound, meaning that the government will buy any unsold sugar for 22 cents a pound. Think about that. So in the mid-1990s, global sugar prices fell to 4 cents a pound, with sugar tariffs at 16 cents a pound. That meant that what? It's unaffordable to sell sugar into the United States. What the U.S. government does is it erects tariff and non-tariff policy that effectively shuts out foreign sugar from the U.S., from the domestic markets. And what does that do? It has the effect of making poor countries poorer that would like to sell their sugar products into the United States. And that's been in place now for nearly 100 years. And its objective has been and remains to protect a relatively small number of domestic sugar producers. We know that price guarantees, tariffs, and quotas lead to market distortions, with producers unable to sell into the target markets, exporters prevented from selling to the U.S. markets with sugar dumped globally, which of course depresses global prices. It hurts poor countries where sugar is an important source of export revenue. I point out here that Brazil represents about 52% of the global sugar market, plus India, China, Thailand, Pakistan, Mexico, Colombia, Indonesia, all of which would love to sell more of their sugar into the United States, but are effectively prevented because of the quota and tariff system that's been in place for many years here in the US. If you look at the downstream effects of steel and aluminum tariffs on these various industries, cars, aerospace, construction, household, heavy machinery, beverages, shale and gas drilling, you're talking about a vastly larger pool of about 11 million workers that are hurt as opposed to 140,000 or so workers in the steel and aluminum industry sector that are helped as a result of those tariffs. So you've got small benefits at the expense of many, which is a good way to summarize our section here on tariffs. Are there any comments or questions here? Okay, so let's take a look at question 16 in chapter 4. Okay, so what we have here is assume the United States is a steel importing nation large enough that the quantity it imports influences world price. You've got the supply and demand schedules for US steel here, and you're asked to plot the supply and demand schedules on the graph. So these are the numbers that you're given. If you look at the graph, all I did, hold on a second. All I did is I plotted the graph, as everybody can see. Yes? I had the same graph, the same numbers that you have. Okay, so we have our supply curve and we have our demand curve. Yes? What do we know? We know that the demand, the supply of the demand plus the world, we have here. We know that free trade price is at $400. And at $400, 12 tons are going to be purchased and 2 tons are going to be produced and 10 tons are going to be imported. Okay? Again, we're given the supply and demand schedule here for the domestic market, and then for the domestic market plus the world domestic supply plus the world supply, which I plotted directly just the way you would. On the exam, I would give you the chart. But here we see free trade. It says that to protect its producers from foreign competition, the government levies a specific tariff of $250 per ton. Well, if it's $250 per ton, well, we know that it's just 150. The intersection on the y-axis has got to be 150 plus 250. That's 350. So that's 350. And then from there, we just have to draw our supply curve. Draw a supply curve here parallel to the existing supply curve. Yes? And what do we see? We see that overall, we see that the price is going to, where does the new supply curve intersect with the demand curve? It's at 600. So go back. We have our new supply curve, which intersects here. We draw our line straight across. That means our overall domestic production increases from 2 to 4 units, or 2 to 4 tons. The overall consumption falls from 12 to 10 tons, and imports fall from 10 to 6 tons as a result of the higher price. So we went from $400 a ton to $600 a ton. Yes? We know that as a result of it being the United States, part of the tariff was absorbed by the exporting nation. So we can plot the welfare effects as follows. We have the redistributive effect. We have the protective effect. We have the revenue effect. And we have the consumption effect. Then we have the terms of trade effect there. So in terms of the answers, your lost consumer surplus, which is 2,200. We just add all these up. Your redistributive effect, which is your transfer consumer surplus, is 600. Your deadweight losses, which is your protective and consumption effect, are $200 each for 400. And your revenue effect, which is your tariff revenue plus your terms of trade effect, gives you $1,500, which is the 1,200 plus the 300. Now, is E greater than is the terms of trade effect greater than the deadweight losses? No, it's not. It's $100 less. The deadweight losses is 400. The revenue effect, the terms of trade effect is 300. So that means overall welfare is going to be reduced by $100. Yes? E is less than B plus D. So your national welfare is reduced by $100. Does everybody see that?
Yes.
I take that as a yes.
Professor?
Yep.
So the line that you drawn at 350, that's how you always do that, right? So you have the SD plus W, which is supply, domestic plus world. And then
we were told the $250 specific tariff. Here's your y-intercept. 100 plus 250 gives you 350 right there.
Yeah.
Then the line has to be drawn right there, parallel to
Got it.
the existing line.
Got it.
That's exactly the way that we do it. For the exam, I'm going to give you the graph. But yes, that's the correct way to look at it. How's that work? Yeah?
Yeah, I understand. So I don't know if you can disclose this information with me. I'm curious to know, how would the question in the exam be about
Yeah,
a
that was
graph
my
like
question.
this?
Yeah. How can we
I'm
draw?
gonna ask you to look at a graph, and I'm going to ask you to look at a graph, and I'm going to ask you to tell me the welfare effects, just the way we did here. For example, in this question here, rather than having to, if I took you back to here, everything's been plotted, and now I'm asking you to determine the free trade, the welfare effects. You, of course, could do that from here. You could determine the welfare effects. You know where the free trade is. If I told you what the tariff, if I told you there was a specific tariff, you know what you would do, and so on and so forth. So, okay. So in terms of the midterm, you have this list. I gave that to you. This covers everything we've done since the beginning. You have this list, which is a summary of all the formulas we've looked at and different hedging techniques. You have this, which is a summary of the evolution of trade theory we've talked about in great detail. This is another summary sheet we talked about. We started talking about industrial policy. This is your summary of small nation, large nation welfare effects, and that's all. In terms of the exam itself, it's going to be 50-55 questions. There'll be extra credit questions. It'll be true, false, and multiple choice. I've given you as much direction as I think that I can. You've all, not all of you, but I've gotten quite a few questions from you. I've responded to them. If there are more over the next couple of days, please give them to me. In our remaining closing minutes, I just want to say a couple of things. I'm going to post for you on Wednesday morning directions and a link to for the exam. And in the afternoon, I'm going to send you a second link to just confirm that we're on schedule to start the exam at 7:30. You will have a link that will allow you to start the exam at 7:30. The exam is 90 minutes. My intention is to get you the grades by Friday. I will post the grades on Blackboard under course documents according to your ID number. So if I don't have your ID number, please make sure that I have it. I do think, though, that I have it from all of you. We're going to come back to class on the 5th of April. I would like you to please have read Chapter 5 on non-tariff barriers. We're going to spend a couple of sessions talking about quotas and subsidies and other non-tariff barriers. Then we're going to have a quiz. Then we're going to do the balance of our work on hedging and financial exchange before we head into the final exam period in May. So again, Chapter 5 on NTBs for the week of 4 or 5. And in closing, in terms of the exam, I would not be focused on the book at this point. I'd be focused on the slides and the summary sheets that I gave you. In terms of looking at the class recordings again, that's up to you. I'm not so sure that that's necessary after all the work that we've done. I think that you've all shown yourself to be diligent and, as I would say, have faith in yourselves, as I do, and all of you. I want to wish everyone, again, continue good luck in your exams. Good luck on this
I have one
exam.
question before we go, please. Is each question worth the same amount? Because I know, like for my finance last
No,
semester.
questions are not all worth the same amount, and it'll be
Okay.
listed on the exam. It'll be you'll see it on the exam. Some questions have multiple parts, and Some questions are true, false that are quite simple, and so of course no. As I was saying just before, I want to wish you all good luck in your exams. Good luck on this exam on Wednesday. And as I said earlier, I hope that you all continue to set an example, modeling good behavior for the people around you in terms of wearing masks and social distancing and doing all the things we need to do to get back into our classrooms and get back to our regular lives. I enjoy working with you.